Hello there. As you know, I'm terrible with introductions, so we're just going to launch straight in. This is going to be a big week for prisons, and I'm very lucky to have someone who's going to be central to this debate, Kate Coleman. Kate, hello. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. Can I just quickly show off my branding?
Yes.
I'm branded.
That is what we're...
Single sex.
That is what we are saying here today. Now, it's interesting that you say keep prisons single sex, because in a practical level, women's prisons are not single sex at the moment.
Yeah, that's correct. But make prison single sex again was kind of not quite catchy. So, you know. Yeah, you're right. Prisons throughout the UK, women's prisons are effectively now mixed sex. The situation in Scotland is particularly dire, as admission to the prison estate is run on a self-ID basis. England and Wales is a couple of steps back from that. But even so, women's prisons are effectively now mixed sex.
Kate, can you first of all tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you become interested in this particular subject?
I'm aware, of course, that Nick Williams at Fair Play, she's done a lot on prisons, and she was the first campaign to actually start focusing on that. And her work goes back to 2017. But I noticed that there was no one campaign that was actually focusing purely on prisons. And that's as opposed to, you know, say schools, where we do now have, or we've had for a long time with Stephanie Davis-Sarai, sole campaigns to do with that. I think the issue of women in prison is particularly important for three basic reasons. Number one, the extreme vulnerability of this group. Number two, the fact that they don't have a voice. I mean, that sounds a little bit patronising, like I'm speaking for them. I would prefer to think of it as I'm amplifying what they're entitled to under law. And number three, the fact that, of course, they have no choice at all in who they are imprisoned with. I don't particularly like the choice argument. You know, you sort of read that all over Twitter. Oh, well, you know, if you don't want to risk sharing a bathroom with a male, then just don't go to the bathroom. Well, I think that's a ridiculous argument. But women in prison don't have a choice what they do or where they go. So they really are literally a captive group.
Yes. So when you talk about the vulnerability of female prisoners, they're in prison, so surely they're not that vulnerable. What do you mean when you call them vulnerable?
I think with women in prison, one of the things that has come out, particularly since the Corston report, which was a huge report done by Baroness Corston, looking at the situation of female offenders, the history of their offending, and their situation within the criminal justice system, that went back to 2007, you see that the background of these women that has been part of their story of offending is full of being victims of violence. There's very, very high rates of sexual assault and child sexual abuse. There are high rates of domestic violence. There's high rates of mental health problems. A really quite shocking figure, which I'll just find here, is that 65% of female prisoners have a traumatic brain injury, and the majority of these were caused by a male partner. And this is all of these figures, all of this is collated by the Ministry of Justice. It is as neutrally presented, evaluated, intended as it's possible to be. This isn't coming from a pressure group. This isn't coming from a feminist organisation. This isn't coming from a prison reform group. This is coming from the Criminal Justice Service and the Ministry of Justice themselves. Another thing that I think is quite important to note is that the offending pattern is very different, and the reasons for those offences are very different between males and between females. So females, they commit significantly fewer serious and fewer violent offences than men. So, for example, all arrests for sexual offences are only 3% women, 97% are men, and women make up only 5% of murder convictions receiving a life sentence. less serious crimes, lower level offences tend to be overrepresented amongst women. And I think an important thing to note here is that things like theft and benefit fraud, they're most likely to have been sparked by the need for them to provide for their children, or because they're trying to support the drug use of somebody else who's usually their male partner. So there's a lot of societal and familial pressure leading up to those crimes being committed, and also a lot of sort of coercive relationships around that. So you've got a very vulnerable group.
And also, when you talk about the nature of the crimes being different between men and women, the amount of crimes is also different. I mean, I can't remember the exact statistic, but isn't the ratio of men, isn't it something like 80,000 in the male prison estate and 3,000 in the female prison estate?
There's 3,800 women, and they represent about 5% of the total prison population.
3,500. And how many? There's 80,000 men, isn't there?
I don't know. I haven't multiplied it up. I don't know. So I just concentrate on the 5%.
Yes,
and
sure.
3,800. And I think what's also important to note is that that level is stable.
Yes.
You know, the levels of crime within the female population are very, very stable. And the numbers who are imprisoned are also very stable.
So what seems to be happening at the moment is Stonewall and other groups have been misrepresenting the Equality Act to organisations and institutions all over the UK. They are saying, for instance, that one of the protected characteristics is gender, when it is not one of the protected characteristics. The protected characteristics are actually sex and gender reassignment, which specifically protects transsexuals, right?
Exactly. So the Equality Act, to discriminate against people on the basis of sex or on the basis of gender reassignment, is illegal and quite right too. However, within the Equality Act, you have a number of exceptions which provide for separate sex and single sex services for females, which allow you to exclude all males where to do so is a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. Now, included within that group of males who it's legal to exclude are those who have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and are those who have a gender recognition certificate. So to exclude those groups of males is perfectly legal. However, as you say, Stonewall and others like Scottish Trans Alliance and Gendered Intelligence, they have been misrepresenting the Equality Act, and they're trying to either completely erase the single sex exceptions or say, well, no, actually, no, what it means is that they're actually single gender spaces. So it's female sex plus female gender identity, and we're going to do it on that basis. So we see that being very effectively translated into prisons policy.
So what effect is the illegal replacing of sex with gender having in women's prisons?
So the Ministry of Justice states two things. Males with a gender recognition certificate, they must be housed in the female estate. There is absolutely no requirement for you to have had either hormonal medical treatment or any form of reassignment surgery as a condition of being granted your certificate. So you have male-bodied, completely physically intact women. Now we come on to those who don't have a GRC. They may also be housed in the female estate. They have to make an application before what's called a transgender case board, where their evidence of presenting consistently in the female gender, plus their offence, their risk, etc., are considered, and they may also be housed in the female estate. You're talking about the influence of these organisations. When we look at the 2015 review into care and management of transgender prisoners, the independent advisor was Jay Stewart of Gendered Intelligence, who's one of the main trans activist organisations and extremely heavily influenced and informed by queer theory.
Right. Yes, which we spoke about last week. I might put the link down below.
Scotland is even worse. Scotland.
How is Scotland worse?
Oh, well, number one, the Scottish prison service regulations on housing transgender prisoners, which date from 2014, so even earlier, and they've been unchanged for the past 6 years. Number one, it's emblazoned with the Stonewall logo and a Scottish Trans Alliance logo on the front cover.
Right.
It reads as if it has been written by those two organisations, and their policy for housing prisoners goes on self-ID. So if your gender identity is that of a woman and it's felt that it is in your best interest as an individual to serve your time in the female estate, that is where you'll be housed. Again, they're saying, as we said before, they tried to make gender identity one of the protected characteristics. And what's also quite interesting is that they have a stab at including gender dysphoria under the protected characteristic of disability. So they try to get the box for protected characteristic under the Equality Act ticked twice.
Wow. So
I know, I had quite a wow moment when I read that, actually.
And this is a big week for this debate, isn't it?
It's an absolutely colossal week, because this is the first time that this policy has been challenged in court. We've had legal cases in the past, but they've been brought from the other side, so to speak. So in the 90s, there were some legal cases brought by male prisoners who were fighting for their right to have gender reassignment surgery whilst they were still being held in the prison estate, and they won that right. And then in, I think it was 2009, there was another legal case which was brought by a male prisoner who had a gender recognition certificate, so he was legally a woman, but he wasn't being approved for his gender reassignment surgery until he lived in the female estate. So he petitioned to be able to be moved to the female estate, even though he hadn't had the reassignment surgery, and he won that. So that's when, if you had a GRC, you were allowed to go into the female estate, came into practice. So we've had these cases on the other side. There was another case where somebody had been denied their GRC and they were fighting for that right. But anyway, so you've had those cases on the other side, but this is the first time that there's a case looking at women's rights in this. So it is absolutely major. And she's doing two things. The first thing she's doing is that she is challenging the government decision to house serious violent and sexual offenders in the female estate, because it hinges on her encounter with a convicted male rapist. And she's also challenging the government policy on the so-called transgender unit that's in the female estate at Downview Prison, and how that is managed on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so that does lead me into my question, okay? And the reason, by the way, I brought up the amounts is because I've kind of discovered that apparently there are so many men applying for GRCs in prison at the moment that if they were all granted, it would increase the female prison population by 150%, something like that. It's like
I think it was roughly that. I crunched some data on what would happen to the female prison estate if self-ID went through. And I didn't actually bring those figures because self-ID hasn't gone through, so I can't leave that. But it was something of that order that the female prison estate would increase by such an order of magnitude. And I can't remember how many male prisoners who are legally women that each women's prison would be expected to house. But it was huge.
Yes.
The jump was massive.
It would be impossible to keep them safe in that situation. And
well,
you know,
exactly. I mean, it's impossible to keep them safe, but it's not just about safety. Safety is the issue that has sparked this. And I should point out, this isn't an isolated incident by any means. I know the infamous Karen White is often bandied about, but Karen White is not an isolated case either. this happens, and we know that this happens. But it's not just about being safe. It's about the right to a single-sex space. Single-sex spaces for females, for women and girls. It's not for female sex plus nice, harmless men, or
Yes.
female sex plus vulnerable men who feel unsafe in the men's facilities. It's for the female sex.
Yes.
And it's that for very, very good reasons.
Yeah.
It really, I don't want my daughter or me to share a changing room with a nice man who's not going to do anything. Most men aren't going to do anything. We know that. But the significant minority who will have always necessitated single-sex spaces, and we know that. So, pretend otherwise is just a bit ridiculous, really.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't understand, and that's what was going to lead me onto my question. I mean, there are going to be more cases like this. We recently had a case in Ireland, in Limerick prison, with a particularly frightening individual being placed in the female estate. And self-ID is the law in Ireland, so one can only imagine the problems they're having at the moment because of this. But what I can't understand is, how have governments walked into this so blindly? The problems with this idea are so obvious and clear. How have they allowed themselves to be placed in a position where they're probably going to be paying out a lot of money to people bringing legal cases?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, really, isn't it? And I think for most right-thinking people, it beggars belief how this can possibly have come to pass and how this can be allowed to stand. But I think what's important to realise is that the trans activist, I mean, that's a very modern term, but I'll use it for historical purposes just because it's an easier thing to understand. Trans activism has been going back till the 70s and 80s. It's been a very quiet, step-by-step process of behind the scenes, not making a fuss, key conversations with the right people to achieve institutional capture. And I think this is what we are seeing. We are seeing the results of this decades-long work. The Dentons, for want of a better term, playbook, which came to light, I think it was the end of last year, was it? I think it was.
Something
and that
like
was
that,
about basically your guide to shoehorning in publicly unacceptable trans policy. In this case, it was to do with youth. I don't think it was children, but it was mid-teens and upwards. Your guide to how to do it. And it's all in there, do it quietly. Don't announce it. Have the private conversations. Attach a little bit onto something which is completely acceptable and will gain public support. And this is what's happened. I think the piggybacking of the T onto the LGB was part of that. We all want to be pro-gay rights. We all want to be pro-gay marriage. We all want that. We all want, the legal and societal definition of the family to include those people in every aspect of life and law. So to just piggyback quietly onto that, well, if you criticise the T, then you're being homophobic. And, it's all part of that. And if you look at the prisons issue, this goes all the way back to the 80s.
Just to come off your point about that, most famously in the Dentons document, they actually praise Irish activists for sneaking self-ID in on the back of marriage equality. So everyone was voting for marriage equality, which we all support.
Absolutely.
And no one realized they were also voting for, prisoners to be put in the female estate and things like that.
There you go.
Anyway, what were you going to move on to?
There was one more point I wanted to make. There's a book by the trans writer Christine Burns called Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows. I even bought it off Amazon just to make sure I was going to be right on this. And there's a quote in there from James Morton of Scottish Trans Alliance. If you remember, Scottish Trans Alliance, logo emblazoned all over the Scottish Prison Service guidance. And in there, he quite clearly says the reason why they went for prisons, they wanted to achieve gender identity in prisons and the self-ID in prisons, because if you do that, it's a precedent for other public authorities and public institutions. So if you can tick prisons off the list, which, nobody gives a damn about, right? It's only prisoners, who cares? Then you've got the precedent and you can start attaching other things on, which is a completely cynical and callous use of women in prison.
So they were able to do it because these are the women we probably hear from the least.
Exactly. They're the women who've got no voice. They're the women who, I'm not being patronising here, but typically as a group, they've got extremely chaotic lives, very chaotic lives, with drug use, prostituted, the victims of child sexual assault, sexual abuse, violence at the hands of men. Not everybody, but as a group, that is prevalent within them. Very chaotic lives. So they're not going to be the ones to en masse organise politically and in a focused way. And, obviously that is absolutely not discounting the remarkable women who've done so much. I'm thinking of Chris Tchaikovsky here in particular, done so much. But as a group, it's a very easy target because of those vulnerabilities.
I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Julie Bindel was such an early target of cancellation, with her speeches being protested and cancelled. And I mean, she was a dirty word, for 15 years,
Oh, yeah, she still is, isn't she?
Yeah. And it's in part because she does so much for women who are in prison and women who've been abused and so on. I wonder if that's why she was such a target.
Quite possibly. I mean, the body of work, she's a complete icon, and she's a total legend in terms of what she's done and what she continues to do for speaking up for women who are at the margins and who, for a variety of reasons, they are disempowered and find it harder to achieve that voice because of all the interacting disadvantages that have cascaded into their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine if you're a woman in prison, the idea of sorting out the situation isn't really going to be uppermost in your mind.
Really surviving, really, aren't you? Surviving, you're worrying about your children. Women in prison are far more likely to be the primary carers of young children than men in prison. The family lives of men in prison can pretty much be expected to continue whilst they're serving their sentence. The complete reverse is true for women in prison. It impacts upon their children, their family relationships, and the next generation in huge ways. And that's going to be your focus,
Yeah. So in terms of what we know, this seems to be quite a closed world. We only ever hear these things when it hits the courts. This is when these women do seem to have a voice, is when they can get something like this judicial review. But how much do we know and how much do we not know about what is going on in women's prisons at the moment?
There's quite a bit that we do know, but there's a huge amount that we don't know. So I'll start with what we don't know.
Yeah.
In line with the MOJ policy that males with a GRC should be housed in the female estate by right, males with a GRC, in all data, all statistics, all records, they are recorded as women or female. So what that means is that those males are successfully hidden in the female data and in the female estate. So what that then means is that it is impossible to ever state the actual number of males that are being imprisoned in the female estate, because all you can do is count the ones who don't have a GRC and who are still recorded as being male. Now, what's interesting is that the Ministry of Justice, they produce an annual report where they feature data and stats relating to all the different protected characteristics. So they include transgender. And they state quite clearly that the figure that they give, they state, well, this is an underestimation because, of course, it doesn't include those with a gender recognition certificate. So they themselves are admitting that they don't know.
Right.
Nicola Williams from Fair Play, she did a piece of research back in 2017, 2018, where she submitted a Freedom of Information request asking about the number of transgender prisoners, and she also looked at their offence categories as well. She produced a figure. The problem is that that figure and the figures ever going forwards will always exclude the males who've got a GRC. So even a Freedom of Information request will not yield the true number. There are other things that we don't know, or there are other ways in which the data is skewed, would probably be a more accurate way to put it. So let's look at the crime stats. We know that male crime has been recorded in the female statistics as having been committed by a woman. There are two cases that I can tell you about. The first one was in 2016, and that was someone called Lauren Jeska, and he was convicted of attempted murder and various other assault and possession of offensive weapon charges. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That conviction for attempted murder was recorded in the female stats as having been committed by a woman. The impact of that was to falsely elevate the female stats for attempted murder for that year by 20%. Because when you have an offence category, which is relatively rarely committed by women, even the addition of just one or two men, it bumps it up significantly. 20%. 20%. So we know of another one, Claire Derbyshire, who was reported all across the media as being a daughter who murdered her father. It's in fact a man. That conviction for murder, again, was recorded in the female crime stats. And for that year, it falsely elevated the statistics by 5%. And again, a Freedom of Information request, you're never going to know. Because if you look at the entry, it will say Lauren Jeska, female, blah, blah, blah. Right. So it's only when the cases come to press, and it's either stated that this is a trans person, or you can disentangle the narrative and it's obvious that this is a male, and then you know that the record is erroneous. But if you didn't know it,
I don't want to.
You wouldn't.
I don't want to sidetrack this, but one of the things I find most extraordinary is how the press is going along with this so unquestioningly. They'll have a photograph of an obvious man who was arrested for a male crime like paedophilia, which is 99% of the time men, who has no discernible, lipstick is even too much work. And they'll call him she throughout the piece. It's one of the reasons, actually, Kate, that I got into this, because if we allow this to go on, we'll go mad. We will go mad because we are seeing stuff that just is not true, presented as if it's true by people who are supposed to be telling us the truth.
Look, gaslighting is horrendous. I mean, but if you think about how bad it is for us reading it in the press, just think what it's like if you're in court. If you're in court and you're a victim. So the Equal Treatment Bench book, which is the guideline for judges and magistrates and tribunals that they should be following. That's got a whole section in it on respecting preferred pronouns, and that gender identity can pretty much be assumed for a defendant. You don't actually have to start asking for pieces of paper or, doing any kind of like background digging or ask for proof or whatever. You can pretty much take somebody at their word in most cases, it says. So you get into the whole thing about preferred pronouns. And we know of cases, I mean, there's been stuff that's been reported in the media, and there's been witness testimony, including one where a man was sexually assaulted by a male work colleague. And this male victim's witness testimony, his statement, refers to his attacker as she. Can you imagine what the impact is? Then, of course, we've got the famous example of Maria McLachlan, who was attacked by Tanis Wolfe. And when that went to trial, she was instructed by the judge to refer to him as she, and shall we say, difficulties in doing so, which are quite understandable and are to be lauded, were criticised when he summed up. And I believe that there's evidence that that impacted on the sentence that he gave, because he was feeling less favourable towards Maria because she'd stood up for reality and refused to perjure herself.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
That's exactly. Yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but it is. They're forcing victims to perjure themselves by referring to male attackers as she. And one of the things I should have said is that one of the best things I've seen from you, Kate. It's so good I couldn't watch the whole thing because I was getting so angry.
I remember we were WhatsApping when you were watching it, and
it was a video of something that trans rights activists tell us either never happens, or if it does happen, then you're saying that all trans people are like this.
Exactly.
That's the two things they use in order to avoid looking at the truth on this, which was, you did a video listing how many people, was it 25? How many men?
It was over 70 criminals
who'd
been referred to as she or women in the press, by the police, on TV, or in the courts.
Yeah.
And that was from 2015 to 2019. I think I stopped midway through because that's when we finished producing it and sorting it out. So obviously there's more now. That's some slides I sent you, which are going up on the website that's being launched this week. And that is 28 males who we know have been housed in female prisons. Again, there will be more than that, because these are only the ones from 2014, because that's the dates that I'm looking at for access.
But the thing about the video, and the reason why I got so angry so quickly, was that there seemed to be a great number of predatory paedophiles represented.
Totally. Oh, totally. I mean, if I can get to these 28 males that I know have been housed in the female estate, all but 2 of them have been convicted of violent or sexual offences. 10 were convicted of rape or attempted rape, including rape of children. 10 for murder or attempted murder, and 4 of child sexual offences. 10 jailed for life, 1 jailed indefinitely, and 5 jailed for between 10 and 20 years. And getting back to that freedom of information request that Nick Williams did, subsequent to the piece of research that she did in 2017, 2018, the Ministry of Justice confirmed that 50% of trans male prisoners, and again, not including the ones with a GRC, have been convicted of serious violent sexual offences.
So presumably that means that statisticians looking at this period will see a huge spike in women who are paedophiles.
That's what I think we can expect, because as I've said, with the true rates amongst women for these crimes being so low and also very, very stable. And the fact that they're stable, I think, is key, is that you are going to start seeing a spike. And that's going to be because males are being added into the stats. But because they've been recorded as female, it will be impossible to disentangle.
Well, I have to say, Kate, well done for not joining up with other women and rioting in the streets, because that's what I would do if I was a woman. It is such a gross insult to women to suddenly pretend that they are capable en masse of the type of things that men are capable of en masse. It makes me so angry sometimes I can barely fucking function. Let's just talk a little bit about, first of all, what do we need to do to undo all this damage that's been done? And secondly, how can ordinary people help?
Gosh, how do we undo the damage? Well, I think it is going to take a long time, because this has been we're seeing the cumulative effects of institutional capture. And I think as we peel back one layer, we're then seeing the other layers in the bedrock upon which all of these things have been founded. So I think it's going to take a lot of undoing. From my perspective, I want prisons to be brought in line with the Equality Act, which is the law.
Yes.
That if anybody is allowed to have a single sex space is women in prison, right? And I'm not asking for anything different. I'm not asking for anything special. I'm not asking for any special considerations, just that the reality of women's lives in prison are acknowledged, and that their legal right to single sex spaces, as is provided for in the Equality Act, is met, and that prison policy and practice reflects that. If you read these documents, they're written as if these provisions in the Equality Act simply don't exist. You know, they'll witter on about the GRA. They'll witter on about this, that, and the other, and quoting things all over the place. You know, they'll witter on about gender identity being a protected characteristic, right? But the actual provisions in the law is as if nobody's ever written them. That is disgusting.
You're asking the systems of law and order in this country to follow the law. That's all you're asking.
Exactly. The law is there. The law is fine. We just need to follow it. And I think what is absolutely egregious, and this is one of the things that's being highlighted in the judicial review, is that the impact on women has never been taken into account when formulating these policies. That these policies, number one, didn't take account of the law, and number two, there was no impact assessment on women at all. And if you look at the history of this, you can just see there's disregard after disregard after callous disregard of the rights of women. And there's one quote in particular which I'm going to read out to you because it's just appalling. So this is relating to that 2009 judicial review, which was brought by the convicted rapist who had the gender recognition certificate, but he was still in the male estate. He hadn't had his reassignment surgery, and the gender identity clinic wouldn't give him reassignment surgery until he had successfully lived as a woman for 2 years, which they said meant that he had to be housed in the female estate. At that time, the criteria for moving to the female estate was that you'd had gender reassignment surgery. So he was obviously in a catch-22. So he brought a legal case, which he won, and he got moved. And if you look here, there's a quote from Dr. James Barrett from the Gender Identity Clinic. He said, "In no very great time, perhaps a couple of months, it will become clear that she," this is the male prisoner, "is so widely accepted as female in that segregation unit in the female estate that location in the main prison will follow. I think that such acceptance will pretty generally apply in the main women's prison also, although there will probably always be a small number of prisoners who will choose to make an issue of the matter because they are the sort of women who enjoy conflict."
Wow. That's,
I mean,
wow.
And, you know, as I said to you, it's not just this case. It's not just Karen White. We've had sexual assaults. We've had consensual sexual relationships, which, you know, shouldn't be happening in prison. We've had a female prisoner who feared that she'd become pregnant because of one of these consensual sexual relationships. We've had threats. This and Karen White being the one that everybody remembers because it was just so horrifying. Not the only ones that have come to light.
Even if Karen White was the only one who...
exactly. Even if Karen White was the only one. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
4 women too many. 4 women too many have been affected by this appalling situation. Kate, who do we write to? Who do we join? What do we do?
So you can follow me on Twitter. You can search for Keep Prisons Single Sex and you'll find me on Twitter. Website is launching this week. That is keep-prisons-single-sex.org.uk. And there is a section on there about what you can do. There's stuff about how you can challenge the media. There's stuff about how you can write to your MP. We need to keep this momentum going, and, you know, we need to keep this in the public eye. That's what we need to do to get change.
Well, Kate, all I could say is thank you very much for everything you're
Thank
doing.
you.
And I hope this case comes in the woman's favor this week. It's so important, and it's just so shocking. I still can hardly believe it's all going on. It's just,
I mean, I wish I could say, it takes a woman to be sexually assaulted before they'll care about it, but we've got a whole slew of sexual assaults behind us.
yeah.
So, but this is an absolutely key issue, and I'm sure when we hear what's going on, when we hear it in court on Wednesday and Thursday, it's going to be absolutely explosive.
Okay, good. I hope so.
Yeah.
Kate, thank you so much for
Thank
speaking
you.
to me. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
And best of luck with the website and the campaign.
Thank you.